Welcome to the Priscilla and Aquila evening seminars. My name is Dan Wu. I'm one of the faculty here at Theological College, and I'm also a member of the Priscilla and Aquila Advisory Board. Welcome especially to those who have travelled a significance to be here tonight, and to those who haven't been here at Moore College before tonight. We're delighted you could be here with us, and we hope that you find tonight stimulating, challenging and encouraging. The Bible's come under fire in recent times, particularly for its attitude towards women. And tonight is the first in a series over this year and next of Priscilla and Aquila Centre evening seminars looking at passages in the Old Testament that seem to be negative towards women. And we begin tonight with perhaps the most confronting and challenging of these, as George Athas, who's been a lecturer in Old Testament here at Moore College since 2006, will lead us through the Bible's attitude towards rape. There's been some heavy criticism towards the Bible on this topic. Some scholars have claimed that the Bible condones the rape of women by men, or at least that the Bible perpetuates an oppressive patriarchal system that leads to it. So is there truth in this? George is going to explore some of the key passages in the Bible concerning rape tonight and draw out some theological and pastoral implications for us in light of what God has to say to us in his word. Of course, in looking at this topic, it's something that may have affected some of us here tonight personally, or affected those we love in deep ways, and so we need to make sure that as we listen, as we think, as we interact, we do so sensitively and caringly for those around us. We hopefully will have some time for questions from the floor. So can I encourage you that if you'd like to ask a question of George, please do so. But if I can also ask you to do so in a way that reflects the gravity of the topic and our desire to see people encouraged and not distressed. And now in the interest of confidentiality and freedom to ask real and potentially confronting questions, we will be recording the talk, but we will not be recording question time. So why don't we commit our evening to God in prayer. Father, you are our maker, our sustainer, our saviour. We thank you for your love for us, and we thank you that in your love for us you have given us your word, which says real things about our real world, including the unpleasant things and the fallen things that shouldn't be. And so tonight, as we look at the difficult and confronting topic of rape, we pray that you would be with us. We pray that your love would surround us and protect us as we talk about this potentially distressing and damaging topic. And we pray particularly for any here who may have been touched personally by the issue of rape, that tonight would be a really helpful time for them. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming along to hear about what is really a very difficult topic to talk about, rape. Rape is vile. It's abhorrent. It's a heinous crime. It is utterly reprehensible. There is nothing good to say about rape. Nothing. Rape is one person forcing another into sexual intercourse against their will. And this deplorable act causes indelible harm to the victim. This is morally detestable, and it is never to be condoned. Never. The Bible does not in any way condone rape. Now, that may come as a bit of a surprise to some people, because the Bible is often characterised as a collection of backward, chauvinistic documents with some morally questionable plot lines and laws in it. Take, for example, comedian and atheist Ricky Gervais. He's quoted as saying, "It's almost as if the Bible was written by racist, sexist, homophobic, violent, sexually frustrated men instead of a loving God. Weird?" The way the Bible treats rape in certain narratives and laws makes us scratch our heads. Because to our modern minds, the Bible at times seems to treat rape almost flippantly. But what I want to do tonight is work through some of the laws that are there in the book of Deuteronomy, as well as a few key narratives in the Old Testament that relate stories about rape, and try to understand them. Ask what's going on in these particular passages. What do they say? What do they not say? What do they imply? And what do they mean for us today? Now, from the very beginning, I'm going to give away the punchline. The Bible shows that rape is not condoned, that rape is equated with murder, that the perpetrator must be held responsible for the crime, that the victim should not be blamed, and that the welfare of the victim is of the utmost importance. Hopefully, as we look at some of the biblical texts specifically, we'll see exactly how the Bible expresses these attitudes towards rape. Now, a word of warning. This is a distressing topic, and occasionally we're going to have to discuss some pretty confronting things. Now, I want to flag that ahead of time because even though you probably expected this to be quite confronting, I just want to, as far as I can, prepare you for that. I have to say that in putting this talk together, it's been the single most unpleasant thing I have ever had to research. There were moments when I felt the pit of my stomach turn in revulsion. So I want to give you ample warning, just ahead of time as before we launch in, that we are about to consider something that isn't just unpleasant, it's disturbing, and at times it's sickening. Well, let's ease into the topic. I want to begin by asking you to imagine. I want you to imagine a young woman, and she's living in another country in the developing world. She's young, she's single, she has her life ahead of her, but living where she doesn't have the kind of opportunities that are available to us in the West. The country that she was born into is relatively poor. Most locals are involved in subsistence activities, they live hand to mouth. And since the country is largely dependent on rainfall for its agriculture, life can be pretty unpredictable at times. There are no social services in her country. There are no welfare payments from the government. There are virtually no charitable organisations working there. Decent health services are very far away. Sanitation isn't great. And so needless to say, many people succumb to disease. There's no real police in the country. Prisons are practically non-existent. There is only a crude military, and they lack the regimented organisation and the discipline of Western armies. They only have the most basic of weapons and training, so it's hard for them to keep order in the country. And so that means that vigilante violence often breaks out, and it goes unchecked and unpunished. Communities often live in fear of opportunistic thugs and civil strife. And because this woman's country lacks a stable government and the policing structures that we have in the West, atrocities abound. As a result, war happens all too often. There are lots of cross-border skirmishes with neighbouring people groups and tribes. The country has very poor infrastructure, so communication is also very poor. Sometimes it's just impossible. But the family is the basic unit of our young woman's society. Family is everything to her. Communities generally try and band together in order to protect each other, but sometimes communities just don't get along with each other, and that results in more conflict, more violence, more strife. Very few people can afford a decent education, so literacy is poor. Most people don't really get any chance to advance beyond working the fields, herding animals, or rummaging through rubbish on the edges of cities. So family is everything. Our young woman's aspirations are not of career, they're not of wealth, they're not of comfort. Her aspirations are of survival. Her aspirations are of humble family life. She hopes one day to marry someone who cares for her, provides for her. She hopes to meaningfully contribute to her community by having children. She will hopefully provide for them. She will hopefully be able to provide for her parents when they get old, and hopefully her children will look after her when she herself gets old. Now, you might be wondering, where is our young woman? Which country is she actually in? Her country is the ancient Near East. Far removed from the modern West, far removed from its wealth, from its technological advances, its stable governing structures, its constitutions, its judicial systems, its police forces, its military, its correctional institutions, its international treaties, its health services, its welfare systems, its charitable organisations, its education levels, its banks, its diversified economies, its individuality and opportunity. I think it's really difficult for us living at this point in history to imagine what life was actually like for someone living in the ancient Near East. Just think about how life has changed in the last century. Now times that by 30 in order to get us back into the biblical period. We are talking massive, massive change. It's the equivalent of someone looking at our society from the year 5014. Imagine what they will see when they look back at us. The ancient world was just vastly different from our own, so it's hard for us to imagine. Women were particularly vulnerable in ancient society because society was far less organised. It was not as diversified, things were not as policed, they didn't have as many institutions that could protect people as we do today. So anarchy was always just around the corner. And that meant that the physically powerful usually ruled the roost. And in almost all cases, that was men. Women in the ancient world were more dependent on men than women are today. They needed men for their own protection. They needed men for their own social welfare, things that perhaps governments supply to people today. Remember, there are no overarching governing structures and welfare systems and police, no therapists that you could turn to. So when problems arose, you couldn't just pick up the phone and dial emergency on 000. Now, understanding these differences between our own context and the ancient context hopefully will help us a little bit come to grips with some of the laws and some of the narratives about rape in the Bible. Let's turn to the laws first of all. First of all, some principles for reading Old Testament laws. First of all, many laws in the Bible, including the ones that we're specifically going to look at tonight, are what we call casuistic in nature. All that means is they provide a law by analysing a specific case or scenario. They don't unpack a principle, they give us a scenario. And so what that means is that moral and legal principles have to be inferred from the actual case or scenario if you're actually going to understand the law properly. The various laws don't go through legal definitions, like our legislation does. The Ten Commandments and the discussion around the Ten Commandments provide a bit of a guide for figuring out what principles to look for. And having more than one case or scenario helps with having some conceptual leverage to try and figure out what principles might be illustrated. In other words, the more scenarios you have, the easier it gets to figure out what principle is being expressed. Also, the cases and scenarios that are presented in the Bible are not exhaustive. They don't cover every possibility. They're scenarios. But the law itself also has flexibility and adaptability built into it. The laws are not always set in concrete. Quite often the laws suggest recommendations, and they allow flexibility for various situations. Now, we're going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 22, in which there are 3 particular cases, and 2 of the cases relate specifically to rape. But we need to consider all 3 of the specific cases that are given in order to infer the principles that are involved. If we only read one of the cases here, we may well and probably will misconstrue what the laws are trying to tell us. So let's have a look at these 3 scenarios. The first one, scenario number 1, you'll find it at Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 23 to 24. I've popped a translation up there on the screen for you to see as well. It says, "If a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married and he sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The young woman because she was in a town and did not scream for help, and the man because he violated another man's wife. You must purge the evil from among you." Now, you'll probably have picked up that this scenario isn't actually about rape. The man and the woman in this particular situation have consensual sex. The concept of not screaming for help here is a practical way of saying the woman consented. Now, the Hebrew of this particular text, it can be taken to refer either to a woman who is already married or to a woman who is pledged to be married, so she's engaged. In either case, the woman is spoken for. She has a husband or a fiancé who can reasonably expect that the children the woman has will be his. In other words, this is a scenario about adultery. The woman's consent in this particular circumstance betrays her husband or her fiancé. And by this betrayal, the paternity of her children is called into question. Remember, this is an age where they don't have DNA testing. And so in this instance, both the man and the woman involved are held culpable and they are sentenced to death for undermining the family structure, the backbone of society. Let's move on to scenario number 2. It's the next few verses. "But if out in the countryside a man finds a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the woman. She has committed no sin deserving death. This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbour. For the man found the young woman out in the countryside, and though the betrothed woman screamed, there was no one to save her." This scenario is clearly one of rape. The woman does not consent to intercourse, and she is instead overpowered by the man. The woman in the scenario screams for help, but to her misfortune, she's out in the countryside, and she can't be heard, with tragic consequences. Now, our modern minds, which are used to litigation, naturally ask a whole series of further questions. What if she's not out in the countryside? What if she's in a city and the rapist prevents her from screaming? What if he has a knife to her throat? What is she supposed to do? She wants to save her own life. She's not going to scream. According to the first scenario, doesn't that mean that if she doesn't scream, she's understood to have consented? And doesn't that then mean that the victim will be accused and found guilty along with the perpetrator and then executed along with him? Now, they're legitimate questions, but they're questions that do come from our modern context, our modern legal contexts, where a clever attorney might look for loopholes, where we have legal definitions and we try to cover all loopholes. But remember, That's not how these laws work. These are casuistic laws. They look at scenarios, and we need to infer what the principle is from the scenario. If we start asking those questions and dismiss what's being said here in this scenario, we probably are doing it because we're just simply coming at it from our own legal perspectives. We're only looking at the letter of the law rather than the principle it's trying to express. That's an attitude that Jesus rebuked the Pharisees in his day for doing. Now, the point in these first two scenarios is not simply that one woman screams and the other doesn't. There's more to it than screaming. In these two scenarios, not screaming is casuistic lingo for consent. So in the first scenario, the woman consents to intercourse. That's why she doesn't scream in that scenario. But in this second scenario, the woman is not consenting. So when compared to the first scenario, this second scenario is clearly a case of rape. To put it another way, a person screaming during an attack does not define rape. Rather, a person not consenting to intercourse defines rape. Screaming for help is just the marker in this specific scenario that the woman did not consent to intercourse and that therefore she was raped. Consent, or rather lack of it, is the central issue. Now, you'll note that the victim in this scenario is in no way blamed for her plight. At no point does this scenario talk about the woman enticing the man, about bringing the situation onto herself. Rather, she is simply identified without qualification as a victim and therefore completely innocent of any wrongdoing. The perpetrator is the one who is held completely responsible for the situation, and it's a crime for which he is accordingly put to death. Now, there are two other details here that in the scenario that we might easily pass over, but they are important for us to notice. The first one is that the law here equates rape with murder. This case, it says, is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbour. That statement acknowledges that rape is one of the most heinous atrocities that one person can inflict on another. It acknowledges that life after rape is a kind of living death. Modern studies have documented the trauma that rape victims live with. To say that the physical and the psychological damage done to a victim makes the victim's life extremely difficult is a massive understatement. For many people, the trauma is simply unbearable. The pain, the grief, the depression, the vulnerability, the anxiety, the loss, it can be paralysing. It's understandable then that rape robs the victim of a sense of true life. It inflicts on the victim something akin to death. It is accordingly utterly abominable in every respect. The second detail we might easily pass over in this scenario is that the woman here in the scenario is either married or she's pledged to be married. Now, why does that matter? Remember, there are no social services in the ancient world. There are no institutional structures to help people out when they're in trouble. No governmental agencies, no charitable organisations to turn to. You are dependent on the powerful, the men in society, to be gracious to you. The victim here in scenario number 2 has a husband or a future husband. And one of the things that the law of Moses does is instruct men, as the powerful ones in ancient society, to use their power responsibly. Not selfishly, not abusively, but responsibly in the service of others. Now, the Bible's often characterised as advocating a sexist, even misogynistic agenda, because it's always talking about men having power. But that's actually to misunderstand the intent of the law. It's not about men holding on to power at all costs. Rather, it's about those who are powerful using their power in service of others. Remember, when you lack institutions that can wield power institutionally like we do, power is naturally going to be concentrated in the hands of a few strong people. And in the ancient world, this was invariably physically strong men. And as the physically powerful, the law of Moses calls on men to emulate God in the exercise of power, in the responsible, compassionate, and loving use of power. God, who is all-powerful, is frequently characterised in the law of Moses as he who executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, who loves the foreigner and gives him food and clothing. In other words, God is someone who cares actively for the vulnerable, and men are called to do likewise. And so, given the principles in the law of love for God and love for neighbour, the victim here in scenario number 2 is to be cared for by her husband or her husband-to-be. He is to be her restorer. He is to love, protect, and provide for her in the midst of the ongoing trauma that she will experience after her attack. To use some New Testament concepts, the victim's husband is to attempt to bring resurrection to her in the midst of the death that has been inflicted on her by her attacker. He's to provide all those services required to enable her restoration and recovery so far as that's possible. The rapist in the scenario is executed. He fails to exercise power in a responsible, compassionate, protective and loving way. He has taken a life, so to speak, and therefore his life is taken as well. Scenario number 3. We read on. If a man finds a girl who is a virgin, who is not pledged to be married, and rapes her, and they are discovered, the man who raped her should pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He should marry the young woman, for he has done her harm. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. Whoa. Scenario number 3 here probably has you scratching your head and probably recoiling in disgust. The idea that a woman be given into the custody of the man who has raped her just seems utterly reprehensible. The logic to us just seems totally incomprehensible. And for good reason. We live in an age where there are decent institutional measures that we can take to ensure that a rape victim is kept well away from her attacker. We have police, we have judiciary, we have correctional services, we have emergency hotlines, hospitals, counselling services, other welfare services and payments. We have banks, independent living arrangements, and they all contribute to making it possible today for a rape victim to be protected and appropriately cared for in the aftermath of an attack. So of course this scenario here sounds appalling to us. But we need to realise that ancient life, when compared to ours, was appalling. We have amazing standards of living. They didn't. All those kinds of services are just listed, which we deem so vital and yet take for granted, they were unheard of They were unimaginable to the ancient mind. It's not that this law rejects them, it's that they didn't exist at all. And so no one could possibly avail themselves of the services that we have today. Their society in ancient times was not as developed as ours. So rather than just simply dismiss this law out of hand from the high vantage point of our own developed, well-resourced modern society, we need to try and understand the logic that this scenario is employing in a much earlier and underdeveloped society. So, there are a few things to note here in this law. First of all, the situation here in scenario number 3 is the same as that in scenario 2, with the exception that the victim is not married or pledged to be married. The woman here is unspoken for, which means that she doesn't have a husband who will be able to protect, care and provide for her after an attack for the rest of her life. The woman back in scenario 2 has that relational mechanism in which she can be loved, protected and provided for in an enduring way by a husband. In other words, the woman's husband is her means of perpetual social security. But the woman in scenario 3 here has no such relationship that can provide her with that kind of social security. She doesn't have a husband to provide for her, to bring her restorative care, to bring resurrection to her in the midst of her murdered existence. Second point. That explains why scenario 3 here allows the rapist to live. Back in scenario 2, the rapist is executed. It was a kind of life-for-life principle. He basically took life and therefore his life is taken from him. But here in scenario 3, the rapist isn't executed. Now, it's easy to interpret that as the rapist getting off scot-free. But that's not quite the case. In scenario 3 here, the rapist has to provide for the welfare of the victim in the absence of a husband who might otherwise have provided ongoing restorative care for her. In being allowed to live, the perpetrator is required to take responsibility for his crime, and he is to use all his means for the rest of his life to make reparation for the damage that he's inflicted on his victim. In other words, the law tells the perpetrator, you live, you pay. Now, I'm sure there are a whole series of further questions that we probably have at this point, so let me try and preempt what some of those are and perhaps deal with some of them. First one, why of all things does the perpetrator paying for the victim's ongoing care require that he marry her? It seems puzzling to us. Well, I think the thinking in the scenario is that there are two reasons. First of all, in antiquity, economics featured in marriage far more than romance did. Now that's a reasonably foreign thing for us today. We get married because we fall in love, not because we want to pool our resources. Now, of course, there are obviously economic ramifications even today when we marry, but we do not marry for economic reasons. If we do, it makes the tabloids. Now, it's not that love was never a consideration in marriage in ancient times. You only have to read the book of Song of Songs in the Old Testament to see that, yes, of course it was. But economics was a necessary consideration, especially given the communal nature of society back then as opposed to our individualistic society today. The marriage that's described here in scenario 3 is primarily about providing economically for the victim. Remember, no police forces. There's no organised judiciary to provide restraining orders. There are no banks with whom to set up monthly direct debits and ongoing maintenance payments. This society doesn't even really have money. It's a bartering economy. You don't pay by writing a cheque or giving over some cash. You pay by delivering wheat by delivering barley, by bringing water, by bringing agriculture, by bringing clothing. And remember, they don't have all the other services that we take for granted today. And in those circumstances, the marriage of the perpetrator to the victim actually then gives the victim complete access to the perpetrator's resources. The second thing, I think, behind the thinking here is that marriage is a permanent covenant. And so this was a way of making sure that the perpetrator provided for the victim for the rest of his life. He couldn't just do something tokenistic and then take off. Scenario number 3 does not permit the perpetrator to divorce the victim. His wealth is essentially to become hers in perpetuity, and that is an arrangement that he is unable to change. He pays for this for the rest of his life. Let me preempt another objection. Surely there are better ways of providing for the victim. Shouldn't she be taken away from her attacker? You know, we might wonder why the victim's father or brothers don't perhaps take custody of the woman who's raped here. Well, a few comments on that. Remember, the priority in these laws is to provide for the welfare of the victim. And I don't think that that prevents other scenarios. Remember, this is just one scenario. The issue of consent, remember, is pivotal to the case of rape. So forcing a victim to marry her attacker would undermine the whole ethos of trying to care for her after having not consented to a particular action. So this scenario doesn't force the victim to marry her attacker. The casuistic nature of this scenario means that there is flexibility. It allows for other scenarios, such as the father taking custody of a daughter, or brothers taking custody of a sister to care for her, or perhaps even a completely different man entering and marrying her. Now, with each of these other scenarios, there are some limitations, and I think it's those limitations that end up with this scenario being the one that's mentioned in the law. So, for example, a father may very well provide for the protection and care of his daughter who has been raped. But of course, it's natural to expect that a father is not going to outlive his daughter. He will most likely die before she does. And so he can't protect and provide for her in the long term. And he certainly cannot father children by her so that when she is old and he is gone, they can then provide for her. Now, it's possible that a brother might give a victim care and protection. But what if she has no brothers? The law of Moses permitted daughters who had no brothers to inherit the estate of their father, but if she's an unmarried daughter, she would be unattached to any male who might give her protection. And in an undeveloped society like the ancient world, that makes a woman extremely vulnerable. It's a situation that actually in the end undermines the very aim of trying to ensure her ongoing welfare. The situation of Naomi and Ruth in the book of Ruth highlights the vulnerability of women in undeveloped societies in just such a situation. Naomi and Ruth are childless widows. They have no immediate male relative that might provide for them and protect them, but they do have a family estate in Bethlehem. Providentially, Ruth becomes dependent on the kindness of Boaz, a distant relative of Naomi's. Boaz allows Ruth to glean in his fields. He orders his young men not to harass Ruth. He makes sure that she can glean in safety. Boaz uses his power responsibly and compassionately. And the happy ending to the story of Ruth is that Boaz eventually marries Ruth, provides Ruth with a son, thus ensuring the ongoing welfare of both Ruth and Naomi, her mother-in-law. So another scenario here is that a victim may well be married by another man who is well disposed towards her. But if the victim has a brother, if there is a brother there, then sure, of course he can protect her and care for her. And in this regard, the story of the rape of Tamar in 2 Samuel 13 is very instructive. Tamar is one of King David's daughters, and she is attacked and assaulted by her half-brother Amnon. Amnon is infatuated with Tamar. He pretends to be sick so that Tamar comes and cooks for him, and he then entices her to bring the food. And this is how the story goes. We pick it up halfway through. Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the bedroom so I can eat from your hand." So Tamar took the pastries she had made and brought them to Amnon, her brother, in the bedroom. As she approached for him to eat, he grabbed her and said, "Come, sleep with me, my sister." She said to him, "No, my brother, don't degrade me, for such a thing must not be done in Israel. Don't do this vile thing. And where could I go to get rid of my degradation? And you'd become a vile person in Israel. So speak to the king, because he wouldn't withhold me from you." But he didn't listen to her. He was stronger than her, so he assaulted her and raped her. Then Amnon hated her so much. He hated her far more than he had loved her. Amnon said to her, "Get up, leave." And she said to him, "No, because this latter wrong of sending me away would be worse than what you've done to me." But he didn't listen to her. He called the servant who attended him and said, "Throw this woman out. Get her away from me, and lock the door behind her." A little later on, Absalom, her full brother, said to her, "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you?" "Well, no, my sister, be silent. He's your brother. Don't set your heart on this thing." So Tamar lived a ruined woman in the house of Absalom, her brother. It's a terrible story, isn't it? It's awful. A little later in the chapter, Absalom kills Amnon for having raped Tamar, exacting the punishment for having psychologically taken her life. This story highlights not just the trauma of rape, but also the trauma of the victim not being provided for afterwards. Tamar insists that her attacker, Amnon, who is her half-brother, not send her away, but rather provide for her. She even goes so far in her desperation to offer to cover up the rape. Such is the fear of destitution that she has. It's such an awful situation to be in. And while Amnon refuses to take the course of action, which is this that's recommended in scenario 3 in Deuteronomy, and it's the scenario that Tamar herself suggests, it's Absalom, her full brother, who comes to her aid and provides for her. Regardless of how you think he's going at comforting her, he's the one who provides for her. So scenario number 3, back in Deuteronomy 22, doesn't exclude other possibilities of caring for the victim. Remember, it's casuistic law. It's recommending a course of action that looks for a lasting arrangement for the welfare of the victim. That's the purpose of the law. It's not a one-size-fits-all law. And it doesn't propose to be a solution that makes everything nice and happy again. As Tamar's story tells us, the victim just doesn't win in any scenario. Tamar lived a desolate life in her brother's household. And while she might have been provided for economically for a time, psychologically she lived with the trauma for the rest of her life. Tragically for Tamar, her brother Absalom dies young. He dies he gets killed in a rebellion against their father, David. And he has left no son behind. So Tamar has no nephew who can then take care of her. And we're never told what comes of her. She's known to us only as a desolate victim. Another objection to the scenario. Shouldn't they try and get the woman away from her attacker rather than making her economically dependent on him? Isn't there a threat of even more violence towards the woman if she's going to be in contact with her attacker? The ideal situation, if we understand the principle behind this scenario, the ideal situation would be one in which the rapist is removed from the situation. We see that from the previous scenario, scenario 2. If he's removed completely from the life of the victim and the victim is provided for in perpetuity in economic dependence, that would be ideal. But in the ancient world, that kind of economic independence, it just wasn't possible for most people, let alone for a young unmarried woman. We today have a number of options for ensuring that a victim is kept well away from her attacker. Economic independence is just a lot easier for us today. We can put offenders in prison, we can arrange government payments and services and counselling and housing for a victim. We have the institutional means to remove the offender from the victim at the same time as allowing the victim to be cared for independently. Ancient people didn't. But in both scenarios 2 and 3, the aim is to ensure that the victim is provided for and that the perpetrator pays for his crime. So, you're doing well, folks. Here's a sum up of where we've come. Deuteronomy shows that rape is not condoned, that rape is equated with murder, that the perpetrator must be held responsible for his crime, that the victim should not be blamed, and that the welfare of the victim is of the utmost importance. Armed with those 5 points, I want to briefly consider now a handful of narratives in the Old Testament that relate to rape. We've already mentioned the rape of Tamar in 2 Samuel 13. I want us to look now at a few other stories. Genesis 19, Genesis 34, and Judges 19. First of all, Genesis 19. Genesis 19 relates the downfall of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot is the nephew of Abraham, the patriarch, and he and his family have settled in the city of Sodom. But God has sent 2 angels to inspect the city because he wants to destroy it. But at Abraham's request, he wants to see if there are even 5 righteous people in the city that might result in the city being spared. The angels, who appear as ordinary men, and they are often just simply called men in this narrative, they arrive at Sodom, and Lot invites them to stay at his home for the night. It's a generous act that extends care and generosity to the otherwise vulnerable, or the apparently vulnerable. So at that point in the narrative, things are actually looking pretty good for Sodom. But then we pick up the narrative in verse 4. Before they, that's the angels, could get to sleep, the men of the town, the men of Sodom, from young to old, down to the last man, surrounded the house. They called out to Lot and said, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out and let us meet them." Lot went out to them at the entrance, shutting the door behind him. He said, "Don't be so evil, my brothers. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never known a man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you see fit. Just don't do this thing to these men because they've come under the protection of my roof." They said, "Get out of the way." And then they said, "This guy came here as a migrant and he keeps trying to be judge. Now we'll harm you more than them." They pressured the man Lot greatly and were about to break down the door. But the men, that's the angels, inside, reached out, pulled Lot inside and shut the door. The men who were at the door of the house, they struck and stunned, from young to old, so that they struggled to find the door. At this point in the narrative, Lot looks like prime candidate for worst father of the year. As a father of 2 daughters, I want to shake him and just say, what on earth are you thinking here? He's willing to give his 2 daughters to a pack of would-be rapists. Now, the narrative doesn't defend or praise Lot for this. In fact, I put it to you that the narrative is designed to make us recoil with disgust at the suggestion. It's also meant to highlight the dire circumstances that Lot finds him in. Someone is about to get hurt. Either it's going to be the 2 men, the angels, or it's going to be Lot's 2 daughters, or it's going to be Lot himself, or all of the above. So Lot is in a very highly pressured situation. He's under duress here. Now, that's not to excuse what he says for his suggested course of action. It's merely to highlight the depravity of the mob that he's confronting. But the way that the narrative gets us to think this is actually ingenious. The narrative has actually fooled us into thinking that Lot is as degenerate as the mob at his door, because he seems willing to allow the pack rape of his daughters. But the narrative doesn't stop there. It continues. Then the men said to Lot, this is the angels now speaking to him, "Do you have anyone else here, a son-in-law or your sons or daughters, anyone else in the town who belongs to you? Get them out of this place, because we are about to destroy this place. Since the outcry against them is so great before Yahweh, he has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who were married to his daughters. He said, "Get up, get out of this place, because Yahweh is about to destroy the town." But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. As darkness lifted, the angels urged Lot, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who've been found, or you'll be wiped out in the town's guilt." But he hesitated. So the men grabbed him by the arm, his wife by the arm, and his 2 daughters by the arm, because of Yahweh's sympathy for him. And they took him and left him outside the town. Now as they brought them out, they said, "Run for your lives. Don't look back." Sodom and Gomorrah are then destroyed. The narrative reveals here that Lot's daughters were not actually in the house, and nor had they never known a man, as Lot said. In fact, both of them were married, and they were actually elsewhere. Lot has to go out of his house to his sons-in-law, presumably where his daughters also are. And these sons-in-law, the text tells us, are married to his daughters. Unfortunately, our English versions largely let us down here by characterising Lot's sons-in-law as pledged to be married to his daughters. But folks, that's definitely not what the text says. It's very clear that these men are sons-in-law and that they were married to his daughters. The NIV 11 has a footnote that suggests this other translation, but because that's actually what the text says. But unfortunately, our translators, I think largely like most of us, have been fooled by the narrative so masterfully into thinking that Lot's daughters are actually just inside the door. But as the narrative very plainly goes on to state, Lot's daughters are married and they're elsewhere. And then eventually they are found, they are brought back to the house. Now that changes the scene remarkably. We discover now, after the fact, that Lot's apparently degenerate suggestion of offering his 2 daughters for pack rape was actually a ruse. Presumably under duress, he was aiming to forestall the mob, offering a decoy, as it were, which he thinks the mob might fall for. And then perhaps he might try to smuggle his 2 guests out of town. As it turns out, they smuggle him out of town. The story takes a dramatic turn. Tension escalates there as Lot makes the suggestion, because the mob then threatens Lot. But then the angels smuggle Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters who have been found out of the town. It is a massive reversal. The whole situation is just turned on its head. And we as readers experience a total reversal in our understanding of the narrative at this point too. So our translators, unfortunately, haven't really helped us here. The narrative doesn't end up advocating rape. It doesn't think that pack rape of men is terrible while pack rape of women is fine. Lot is not the degenerate father we initially think. On the contrary, the narrative omits critical information at a critical moment. And then before it reveals this critical information to us, the narrative uses our revulsion at rape to evoke a particular response in us as readers, and then it uses that response as a mechanism to surprise us when the information is made known to us. And we as readers, along with most of the characters here, undergo a massive reversal. It's one of the most skillful examples of detail omission in a biblical narrative. Let's move on to Genesis 34. Genesis 34 relates the story of Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. The story begins. Dinah, the daughter of Leah, who had borne children for Jacob, went out with the young women of the land. Shechem, son of Hamor, the Hivite, a noble in the land, saw her. He took her, slept with her, and degraded her. His soul was bound to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. He loved the girl, and he spoke tenderly to her. Now, there's a lot of confusion in this narrative, because it's not altogether clear whether this is a story of rape or a story of consensual sex. On the one hand, the word that describes what Shechem does to Dinah is the same word that's used to describe what an attacker does to his victim. He degrades her. Tamar, for example, pleads with Amnon, "Do not degrade me." Now, this might mean that Shechem rapes Dinah. But notice also that Shechem, after seeming to initially at least objectify Dinah, actually shows genuine feeling for her and tenderness and seems to love her. Has he raped her, or has he seduced her? It's possible that Dinah has consented to Shechem's overtures. But even so, even if that's the case, the narrative describes what Shechem does to Dinah, an unmarried woman, as degrading. In other words, premarital sex here is depicted as degrading. Unfortunately, the narrative doesn't give us Dinah's side of the story. I wish it did. Unfortunately, Dinah has no voice in this particular story. In the end, this is not a story about Dinah. It's actually a story about Jacob and his relationship with the locals amongst whom he's a migrant. And so the narrative just leaves us feeling really sorry for Dinah and wondering what her side of the story actually is. But whether she consented or whether she didn't, she has been degraded and objectified. And the responsibility for that is put at the feet of Shechem. He's the one who held power in the situation, and he abused that power. And so even if Dinah had consented, Shechem has still mistreated her. I think the narrative is probably more likely a story of seduction than of rape. I think that because when I compare it to what happens to Tamar in 2 Samuel 13, I think there is a marked difference. Shechem's attitude after the fact is vastly different to Amnon's. Amnon hates Tamar and wants to get rid of her, whereas Dinah wants nothing but to be with her and to marry Dinah. But whereas Tamar has a voice in 2 Samuel 13, unfortunately Dinah here in Genesis 34 doesn't have a voice. The only thing that we can be sure of in this narrative is that Dinah has been demeaned and she's been objectified through the entire experience. Last passage, Judges 19. Judges 19 is one of the most horrific stories in the entire Bible. It begins in a very similar way to the story of the angels coming to Sodom in Genesis 19. We have a Levite who has a concubine and a servant, and they are travelling through the highlands of Palestine. They're looking for a place to spend the night. He doesn't want to spend the night in Jerusalem because foreigners live there. He doesn't know them. doesn't trust them, so he goes to where people of his own ethnicity are, where there are Israelites. He goes a little further north to the town of Gibeah in the territory of Benjamin. And an old man in the town takes him in for the night and offers him appropriate hospitality. And so we pick up the story at verse 22, where the Levite and his host are dining together. They were enjoying themselves when suddenly the men of the town, degenerate men, surrounded the house and pounded on the door. They said to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house and let us meet him." The man who owned the house went out to them and said to them, "No, my brothers, don't be so evil. After all, this man has come into my house. Don't do this vile thing. Here are my daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out, and you can degrade them and do as you see fit with them. But to this man, do not do this vile thing." The same revulsion that we felt in the Lot narrative, I'm sure we're all experiencing again. But while we were able to see that Lot was trying to trick the mob, there's no indication in this narrative that the owner of the house is trying to do the same thing. The narrative simply doesn't give us any clue about whether he's employing a ruse or not. So on the simple reading of it, the old man who owns the house here just advocates a course of action that implies men are inviolable, but women aren't. And he objectifies women as mere commodities, his own daughter included. It's a sickening thing. And unfortunately, there is nothing in the remainder of this narrative to turn the story on its head as there was in the Lot story. This story becomes horrific in the extreme. The men wouldn't listen to him. So the man grabbed his concubine and brought her to them outside, and they raped her, abusing her through the entire night until morning. Then they sent her away as darkness lifted. The woman came at daybreak and collapsed at the door of the house where her husband was until it was light. When her husband got up in the morning, he opened the doors of the house and went to go on his way. And there was the woman, his concubine, collapsed at the door of the house, her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let's go." But there was no response. So he put her on his donkey, and then the man got up and went to his own place. He entered his house, took a knife, grabbed his concubine, and dismembered her into 12 pieces. And then he sent her through the entire territory of Israel. And then all who saw it said, "Such a thing has never been done or seen in Israel from the time the Israelites came up out of Egypt to this day. Consider it, evaluate, and speak up." The story goes on to relate how the tribes of Israel came together and engaged in a civil war against the tribe of Benjamin, who perpetrated this crime and almost wiped the entire tribe out. I tried to find one good thing in all of this narrative. I couldn't find it. It describes an atrocity by the men of Gibeah that is horrific and utterly reprehensible. And the actions of the other men in the narrative, the owner of the house and the Levite, they are shocking for their callousness. It's little wonder that this incident lies at the end of the book of Judges, which relates Israel's downward spiral into moral corruption and degeneracy that threatens their very existence as a nation. This is the low point. The narrative doesn't condone any of the behaviour here. Rather, it just simply describes something that is altogether an atrocity. Now, a couple of things to bring to your attention. First of all, it's unclear who brings the concubine's the man's concubine out to the mob? Is it the owner of the house, or is it the Levite himself who is married to the concubine? The text simply says the man brought his concubine out. But given that the owner of the house is the man who has just been speaking, I think we're meant to understand that it's the owner of the house, not the Levite, who reaches in and pulls the concubine out. After all, he just made that suggestion. Critically, he doesn't bring his own daughter out. He just brings the concubine out. And so I think we're meant to understand that the old man here has betrayed the hospitality of his own guest. But secondly, notice the callousness of the Levite the following morning. Even if he isn't the one who handed over his concubine to a rapacious mob, his response on seeing her collapsed outside the door is one of the most heartless acts in this narrative. He seems to have no concern whatsoever. No tenderness, no sympathy, nothing. He doesn't go out looking for her during the night. And when he sees her in the morning, he doesn't even bend down to check if she's okay. He simply sees her in the morning, concludes that she's dead, and then with clinical coldness dismembers her body later on and then sends the pieces through Israel as a rallying cry. The nameless concubine, this poor woman, she doesn't even suffer a living death after her attack. She is horrifically raped to death. And the one man who should have cared for her treats her as an object, as a piece of meat. This poor woman, whose name we will never know, was thoroughly dehumanised and robbed of all life. I think that's underlined even more when we read on and get eventually to 1 Samuel 11, where Israel has appointed King Saul. Saul comes from this town, Gibeah. And when he hears about a town on the fringes of Israelite territory, he takes the oxen that he's just been ploughing with and he cuts them up and sends the pieces through all Israel as a rallying cry. All Israel comes together, they fight against an external enemy, and a great victory is achieved. When you compare that with what the Levite does here, the Levite treats his concubine like Saul treats oxen. I struggle to find words that describe how callous that is. And when we also think about the laws in Deuteronomy and what they were trying to achieve, namely the welfare of a rape victim, we have to conclude that not only were the men of Gibeah degenerates, but the Levite treated his concubine in a dehumanising way. All the men in this story in Judges are cold, heartless, sexist criminals. This incident is one of the lowest moral pits in Israel's history. There is nothing in this narrative that the author wants to commend to the reader. It is altogether an atrocity. Folks, there's a lot more I could say. I've gone on for a long time. I haven't even broached certain topics, such as what happens when someone falls pregnant as a result of rape, or what happens when a trusted person, such as a husband, rapes. We simply don't have time to deal with all these other issues, but let me draw some conclusions and make some pastoral observations. First of all, the Bible is often misunderstood today because we fail to account adequately for its ancient context, which lacked the developed society that we enjoy today. Secondly, the Bible never condones rape. In any and every instance, rape is a crime that is on a par with murder. And we need to realise that rape robs the victim of life, in a certain sense. Rape leaves an indelible mark on a victim. To call it a scar or a wound, I think, is to underestimate the enormity of rape. Rapists, therefore, must be brought to justice. The Bible doesn't blame the victim of rape for what occurred to them. In every instance, it's the perpetrator's fault. If we take seriously the teaching of the Bible, then we must never think that a rape victim brought an attack upon themselves. Because no matter what a person may or may not do, at no point is rape ever an acceptable response to anything. No one deserves rape. Rape is an atrocity and it is completely unacceptable. Rape needs to be prosecuted. It should never be minimised and never treated flippantly. The laws and the narratives that we've examined tonight show us that sex is a powerful thing. Sex should never be used as a weapon of power over others. Sex requires consent and context within marriage. But also, no one is owed sex. We need to state that very clearly for our society. I mean, just last week, Elliot Rodger in Los Angeles went on a murderous rampage because he felt women owed him sex and they did not give it to him. That attitude can have deadly, deadly consequences. But folks, it doesn't take a crazed maniac to think that they are owed sex. One of the most prevalent attitudes to sex in our day and age is that people not only have a right to sex or sexual expression, but even a need for sex. And that if you don't have sex, then you are in some way being repressed. No one ever died for lack of sex. It's actually profoundly harmful to human relationships to think that we are owed sex or that we need sex. And yet, in an increasingly pornified culture, that's the message we keep encountering. Sex is a powerful thing and it's easily misused. Sex is always best expressed between a man and a woman in a consenting, permanent, loving marriage in which both the husband and the wife are affirmed and valued by their spouse and in which children are welcomed. The Bible's essential ethic, which is love for God and love for neighbour, means that when rape occurs, the primary concern is to take care of the victim. Having studied the laws and the narratives that we've considered tonight, I thank God for the institutions that we have today, that we've developed in our society that allow for a rape victim to be cared for. Our society owes a lot to biblical ethics on this one. We've developed mechanisms that allow us to remove a rapist from the victim's situation. The number one priority must always be for the care of a victim after an attack, and to do so in an ongoing way, not thinking that, they'll get over it. Because if rape is on a par with murder, it leaves an indelible mark on the victim, and so ongoing care is required. Let me just finish with two words. First of all, a word to pastors. Rape and sexual abuse are unfortunately too common. And so you may very well find yourself ministering, you probably will find yourself ministering to a victim of rape or sexual abuse. Please minister to that person with all the love and compassion you can muster. Rape is a dehumanising experience that is rightly seen as a crime on par with murder, and it affects the victim for the rest of their life in the most profound way. Please find out what counselling services are out there, how people can be assisted in our day and age. We live in a developed and diversified society that has resources to help people. I've compiled a short information sheet that people will be given on the way out that gives you some information about some of the services available. Finally, a word to victims. You may be here tonight because you or someone you know is a victim of rape. Firstly, let me say how profoundly sorry I am that you have experienced that. I found it grueling just doing the research for this seminar. I can scarcely imagine what horror you have experienced both in the actual ordeal and subsequently. I've come to realise, at least from an observer's point of view, that living with rape is a form of living death. Now, I've been dealing with generalities tonight, but I hope I haven't misrepresented anything. If I have, please forgive me. I certainly don't want to minimise what you've experienced and what you continue to live with. I also realise that this seminar might have exposed some very deep-seated emotions, perhaps triggered some memories that you'd rather care to forget. I'm sorry if that's the case. But I think you'll agree with me that this is a topic that needs to be addressed. I do hope, if you haven't already, that you'll avail yourself of the relevant services that exist to help you. Please take one of those information sheets and follow up on it. And while humanity may have done this terrible thing to you, please know that God loves and values you. God does not approve of what happened to you. And even if our human institutions end up failing you, His divine justice and His supreme love will not fail you. God has gone to great lengths to demonstrate His love for us. He Himself has experienced injustice, violence, harm, and dehumanisation. But He Himself will have the last word as a just judge, as a caring creator, and as a loving Father. I pray that you come to know the love and care of God, and that He give you the strength to continue on in life, to persevere, and even to overcome and experience restoration. Thank you, everyone, for your attention.